This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. A former NAFTA negotiator weighs in on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Ira Shapiro argues it will benefit the American economy and put us in a better position in the competition with China. With the Supreme Court ready to end its term with a flurry of important decisions, legal expert Ian Millhiser concludes that historically, the court has sided against the bad guys. And Bill Press talks with Congresswoman Jackie Speier, an opponent of TPP. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Ira Shapiro negotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement. He tells us why he thinks the very controversial Trans-Pacific Partnership is necessary, and that it's not as bad as progressives have made it out to be. And we say hello to Ira Shapiro, head of a consulting firm specializing in international trade, U.S.-Japan relations, and American politics. He brings to the firm 40 years of experience in senior staff positions in the U.S. Senate, the Clinton administration, and private law practice. He is also the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Last Great Senate, Courage and Statesmanship in Times of Crisis. Ira Shapiro, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's good to be with you.
And we appreciate your time with us. You are a former chief trade negotiator for Japan and Canada, so you have a great deal of interest in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Why is it needed? And perhaps more importantly, what chances does President Obama have of getting it past Congress?
I think it's needed because the Asia-Pacific region is the most dynamic economic region in the world. In the next 20 years, several 100 million consumers in that region will join the middle class. These are the markets of the future, and we need to remember that our country is only 5% of the world's population. We prosper by engaging and selling to our manufactured goods, our services, our agricultural goods to the other 95%. President Obama ran as a trade skeptic for president. And after the economic emergency was done, he looked at the situation and realized that the Asia-Pacific region was economically integrating, and it was doing so without us. We were on the outside. We would be disadvantaged. He concluded that it was important for us to be part of the Asia-Pacific and indeed to take the lead in an important negotiation. I think he was right about that. I think he reached the conclusion that any president, Democratic or Republican, would reach. As to whether he will get the negotiating authority that allows for the completion of the TPP and whether TPP will be approved, I fervently hope so. The Senate gave him that authority, 61 to 38, and I think that the House vote appears that it will be sometime this month, and it will be very close. But I think that many members know that despite the political pressure they feel from opponents, that the right thing for our country is to move ahead and give him the authority and complete this negotiation. And so I believe it will prevail by a narrow margin.
Is the agreement really all about isolating or perhaps weakening China in the Pacific region?
I think of it as more competing with China in the Pacific region, offering our vision for what the rules of the global economy and what the rules of the economy for that region would be. Rules-based, high-standard trade agreement. I think it's really important that we are working with Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, and 7 other countries. China, at some point, I hope, would join the Trans-Pacific Partnership some point in the future. They're not ready to do it now. But if we defeat this agreement, China's the only winner. China proceeds with its state capitalism and standards that don't come up to ours in terms of things like labor, the environment, intellectual property, the digital economy, an open internet. This is a very important situation, and I think it's vital that we have our competitive vision and model out there in the Asia Pacific.
Now, of course, there are plenty of critics, and they say that trade deals like this inevitably result in job losses. Is this just another NAFTA?
Well, I mean, full disclosure, you're talking to a NAFTA negotiator, so I might not share the view of NAFTA that some others do. Mm-hmm. Look, how many jobs are lost because of trade agreements is one of the most complex and hotly debated issues that there is. Many jobs have disappeared over the years, particularly over the last 20 years, because of technology. It takes fewer workers to produce steel or autos than it used to. We don't have as many gas station attendants or bank tellers or travel agents as we used to. These are all technological changes. Certainly, many jobs have been lost to international competition. But even those are not the fault always of trade agreements. We're actually doing better in terms of trade with countries where we have agreements than where we don't. So I realize that NAFTA has many detractors, but it represents a moment when the trade debate in the United States changed. But the truth is, we prospered throughout the 1990s after NAFTA was agreed with. And we increased trade with both Canada and Mexico since NAFTA. North American manufacturing and competitiveness is an important part of our challenge in responding to China. And frankly, I'd hate to think of where we'd be in terms of our relationship with Mexico had the NAFTA opponents won.
We're speaking with Ira Shapiro, heads up a consulting firm that specializes in international trade, U.S.-Japan relations, and American politics. He's also the author of the book, The Last Great Senate, Courage and Statesmanship in Times of Crisis. Overall, how would the TPP benefit the average middle-class American, and how do we protect those whose jobs disappear?
Well, I think, first of all, we are obligated to protect those whose jobs disappear, and I wouldn't limit it to just jobs that disappear because of trade agreements. I would extend it to changes in employment due to technology changes or other job losses. We've had trade adjustment assistance in the past. We're going to have it again. And I think it should be strengthened and expanded with some form of wage insurance to make up for a difference in income that people might encounter. But beyond that, TPP benefits Americans because it contributes overall to a stronger economy. We will be a stronger economy if the Asian economies are subscribing to our labor standards, higher environmental protection, greater intellectual property, and bringing down tariffs that are still extraordinarily high in many of these countries. Some of them, Japan, for instance, has very low tariffs. But these other countries, the developing countries, still have very high tariffs that are harming our agricultural goods, our processed foods, all kinds of things. So there are a lot of ways it benefits us.
Now, it's also been said that Hollywood has a stake in passage of TPP. How so?
Well, Hollywood, our movies are very much in demand around the world. And as markets expand and trade barriers come down around the world and intellectual property standards rise, our motion pictures get more access to these markets. I looked at some statistics recently and noticed that I think U.S. and Canada motion pictures revenue was like $11 billion in 2013. Worldwide, it's more than 3 times that. And China, for instance, is the most rapidly expanding motion picture market for U.S. motion pictures. And if you look at it, the 2 things that expanded the market in China, 1, China's acceptance of the terms of the WTO, and 2, the fact that we won a couple of important WTO cases against China, which enormously benefited the motion picture industry. So the motion picture industry has been a big supporter of expanded global trade and stronger rules, and they'll benefit from it.
What about health and pharmaceutical industry?
Perhaps the most complicated and indeed one of the last issues that will be resolved in this negotiation. And it's complicated for a lot of reasons. If you look at our debate in the United States only, we have a tremendous ongoing discussion between the research-based pharmaceutical companies who have breakthroughs that are important in terms of life-saving and health-saving drugs, but we also have a vigorous generic industry in order to bring drugs to people at lower costs. And we've had trouble balancing that. Each country that we're negotiating with is trying to work out the same balance, and then the negotiators are trying to come up with rules that cover all of them. So it's a really tough issue, but it's an issue where international trade negotiations have proven effective in expanding intellectual property, but also increasingly ensuring access to life-giving medicines.
Now, progressive opponents say that a new international arbitration board would violate U.S. sovereignty, but don't progressives generally support international organizations like the World Court, the UN? I mean, is this hypocritical?
I think this again is one of the issues that's been extremely complicated, and there's been a lot of rhetoric about it. The fact is that trade agreements for quite a while have included some kind of investor-state dispute settlement system, so that if investors felt that they were not being treated fairly by a trading partner, they could bring it to some kind of a tribunal. The critics and the opponents of the TPP have invoked the specter of all kinds of threats to our health and environmental laws. Foreign countries could challenge them. There have been cases, a small number, where such challenges have been brought. They have never been won. I think the last time I looked, we had won 17 out of 17 of those cases. But the truth is, I'm not going to get into whether it's hypocrisy or not. I don't know that it's hypocritical is the right word. I think that the fears that have been expressed have been exaggerated. When people say somehow that the trade agreement is a threat to our sovereignty and our health and our environment, think about what we really know about our own domestic debate. We've got a very vigorous debate over the environment. It's between people who believe in climate change as a problem and people believe that it isn't. People who believe EPA is overreaching. It has nothing to do with trade agreements. And that's the same thing in the health space. So this is, I think, an issue that's been quite exaggerated.
Okay. Ira Shapiro headed the consulting firm specializing in international trade, U.S.-Japan relations, American politics, and, of course, author of the book, The Last Great Senate, Courage and Statesmanship in Times of Crisis. Ira, thank you again for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
No, it's always my pleasure. Thanks so much.
We appreciate your time. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Legal analyst Ian Millhiser says the liberal Warren Court was an anomaly in the Supreme Court's history. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Let us now praise an odd bedfellow threesome. One Democratic ex-senator, an American citizen in exile, and a current Republican senator. I don't think they've ever met, yet their separate efforts over 14 years have now guided our ship of state away from some perilous authoritarian straits. First came Russ Feingold of Wisconsin, a former Democratic senator who refused in October 2001 to sacrifice our fundamental liberties to the fears and rank political opportunism that followed the horrific 9/11 terrorist attack. The Bush-Cheney regime was using 9/11 as an excuse to hustle their liberty-busting U.S. Patriot Act into law. But Senator Feingold dared to object, pointing out that it would impose a 1984-ish secret security state over our people's freedoms. He was the lone senator to vote no. Just as he warned, the act proved to be deeply unpatriotic. But Congress, the media, and we the people were kept in the dark about it until 2013, when a young security analyst named Edward Snowden blew the whistle, revealing that cyber snoops were collecting and storing all of our phone records. The spy establishment retaliated by forcing Snowden into Russian exile. But their dirty deeds were now exposed, roiling the public and increasing congressional opposition to this wholesale invasion of our privacy. Enter Rand Paul, a Republican senator and longtime libertarian opponent of Patriot Act madness. The act had to be renewed by June 1, and the establishment assumed no lawmaker would dare block it. But Senator Paul did, using 11th-hour procedural moves to force a rewrite that ended some of its worst intrusions, including the government's bulk collection of your and my phone calls. This is Jim Hightower saying, liberty depends on true patriots like Feingold, Snowden, and Paul.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Ian Millhiser has written extensively about the Supreme Court, and as the 9 justices finish this term with important rulings, he says that time and time again, the good guys lose in the highest court in the land. And we say hello to Ian Millhiser, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund and the editor of Think Progress Justice. Ian is also the author of a new book called Injustices, The Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted. Ian Millhiser, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's good to be back. Thank you so much.
Well, we're happy to have you with us, of course. Now, your book is different from others on the Supreme Court because it tells the history of the court through the eyes of people whose lives have suffered because of anti-democratic decisions. Yet, shouldn't the highest courts ignore the individuals and instead determine general legal theory?
Well, I mean, the job of the court is to follow the law. There's no question about that. But when the court decides its cases, especially when they decide cases wrong, those cases can have a tremendous impact on millions of people. I discuss in the book the plight of child laborers for much of this nation's history. In the coal towns up in Pennsylvania, they would employ 6-year-old boys. They would sit them down above a chute of coal. And the boy's job was to reach down into it, and like they saw a piece of slate or something that wasn't coal that they need to pick out of it, they'd have to pick it out and throw it in and throw it away. The boys would have their fingers crushed. They'd sometimes lose their arms because the mechanisms that moved this coal forward, their arms could get caught in it. They would fall down the trash chutes and suffocate. And of course, many of them, they'd spend 30, 40 years in the mines after that, and they'd die young men from black lung disease. The Supreme Court, after Congress passed a law banning child labor, the Supreme Court struck that law down. They doomed those children to many more years working in those coal mines, working in cotton mills in the South, working in factories up north. There were Southern cotton mill owners who wanted to eliminate adult male laborers because it was cheaper to hire kids. Their goal was to have someone start in the cotton mill when they were 6, work in the cotton mill until they're old enough to have a kid themselves, and then they get laid off and replaced by their own 6-year-old son. And the Supreme Court said that was right. The Supreme Court struck down that law under a theory of the Constitution that that just made no sense. They said that a regulation of child labor wasn't a regulation of commerce.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yes, the Supreme Court needs to follow the law. That's their job. But when they get it wrong, the impact is so broad and it has such tragic consequences.
Most Americans, I think, look at the court as a bulwark against discrimination. But you say that the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case that outlawed school segregation could have gone the other way, except for a series of historical accidents. What were they? Talk about that a little bit, if you would.
Sure. I mean, there are a number of them I discuss in the book. I'll just mention a few of them. So the initial vote in Brown, after the justices first heard the case, there were 3 justices who were sure votes to uphold segregation. There were 2 who were on the fence, and then there were 4 who actually wanted to do the right thing. So it looked like there was a very good chance that the good guys were going to lose. One of the 4 justices who voted to strike down segregation was Hugo Black, who had been in the Ku Klux Klan. He was a former Alabama senator, and, he had a change of heart after he got on the court, but you never would have guessed, based on who and what he was before he got there, that he would have turned out to be a champion for civil rights. The governor of South Carolina at the time, the guy who hired one of the best lawyers in the country to defend segregation, was Jimmy Burns, who was a former justice himself. And, if he decided to stay on the court rather than go on and do other things, he would have been an almost certain vote for segregation. The Chief Justice, when the case was originally decided, wasn't Earl Warren. It was Fred Vinson. Vinson was one of the 3 votes who voted to keep segregation, and he died of a heart attack midway through the case while it was still being considered. President Eisenhower, who put Warren on the court, later said that putting Warren on the court, he said some other choice things that I can't repeat here, but he said that putting Warren on the court was the biggest damn fool mistake he ever made. So there were all these pieces that had to fall into place. If Black had turned out like you would have expected Hugo Black to turn out, if Burns had stuck around, if Vincent hadn't died, if Eisenhower had realized that Warren was going to be a liberal justice, if this guy named Parker had been confirmed that Herbert Hoover nominated, there were all of these pieces that had to fall into place for Brown to come down the way it did. And, the more likely course of history was that Brown would have been wrongly decided.
We're speaking with Ian Millhiser, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, editor of Think Progress Justice, and author of the book Injustices, the Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Deflecting the Afflicted. Why, Ian, has the Supreme Court so frequently throughout history protected the wealthy and privileged? Is it a matter that they're all privileged people, or is it something about putting on a black robe? I mean, what gives there?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, some of it is that I think a lot of it is that the justices tend to respond to the people that they tend to interact with. And for much of American history, de Tocqueville said that that lawyers are the last vestige of aristocracy in the United States. For much of American history, the legal profession as a whole was very skeptical of democracy. Believed that the law should change slowly, if at all. And it was very, very conservative in that way, and that tended to influence the justices. Now, I think, you almost have 2 legal cultures in the United States, where you have a mainline legal culture, but then there's a very influential conservative legal group called the Federalist Society that has worked very hard to build an alternative legal culture, and I always cover their meetings. I want to see what they're up to. They are trying to build the bridge back to the 19th century. At the last conference, they had panels on why we should get rid of the minimum wage, and they had speakers talk about why we should get rid of anti-discrimination laws. So, I think the problems, and 3 justices, by the way, are very prominent members of this society. So, I think the problem is that, people tend to be influenced by the people that they interact with. And one advantage of being an elected official is that members of Congress at least have to interact with people who aren't like them because they need those folks to get elected. On the Supreme Court, that's just not the case.
In the modern era, what has been the worst Supreme Court decision? Bush-Gore, Citizens United, Hobby Lobby?
You should ask me that question in a few months because there's a case pending in front of the Supreme Court right now that seeks to gut the Affordable Care Act. If it prevails, it will mean that millions of people lose their health insurance, possibly overnight. It will mean that as many as 10,000 people will die every year who otherwise would have lived because they won't be able to get health care. I mean, if the Supreme Court, and the legal theory in this case is a joke. The legal theory in this case is you can take one sentence of the entire Affordable Care Act, read it completely out of context, and not even read the parts wall that define the words that are used in that sentence. That's the legal theory in this case. If they go along with this, I will rank that on a scale of evil against virtually anything that the Supreme Court has done in American history.
Mm-hmm. Trumping all of just those three that I even mentioned. And I mentioned Hobby Lobby. That case, of course, it carved out a religious exemption from the ACA or Obamacare. Given the political and business uproar over the Indiana religious liberty law, do you think that official intolerance is on the rise, or are more middle-of-the-road people seeing the folly of state-sponsored discrimination?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So, Hobby Lobby said for the first time that a religious objection can be used to diminish the rights of someone else. What the law had been up to that point is we all have very robust religious freedoms, which we should have to exercise our faith, but it also said that you cannot use your religion to take away the rights of someone else. And Hobby Lobby changed that. Hobby Lobby said that the owners of Hobby Lobby could wield their religion as a sword in order to cut down the access to birth control that their employees were supposed to have. The open question after Hobby Lobby is whether that's also going to extend to discrimination. Hobby Lobby does say that it won't extend to race discrimination, but what about anti-gay discrimination? What about discrimination against women? The lesson I think from Indiana is that, I don't know what the justices are going to do when that question reaches them, but the country clearly doesn't want that to happen. If the backlash was so severe that even an extraordinarily conservative governor like Mike Pence had to back down, no one wants, except for, a group of extraordinary radicals, no one wants a world where businesses can discriminate against someone, where business can say, I'm not going to serve you because you're gay.
Yeah, I sort of always assumed we had gotten over that in the last century. And obviously we've got some work to do.
No doubt. I've written before about how the exact same arguments claiming that religion can justify anti-gay discrimination were used to justify other forms of discrimination in the past.
Yeah.
If you read the lower court's decision in Loving v. Virginia, the decision where the Supreme Court eventually struck down the ban on racial marriage discrimination, or basically struck down racial marriage discrimination, the judge in that case, his argument, which was a really common argument at the time, was that God placed different colored people on different continents, and that showed that God wanted segregation. That was an actual argument that people used to make in order to justify Jim Crow.
Well, hopefully we're evolving upward as opposed to backwards. Ian Millhiser, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, editor of Think Progress Justice, author of a new book called Injustices, The Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted. Ian, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
All right, thanks so much for having me.
All right, take care. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect Stand Up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Congresswoman Jackie Speier.
We move on to the easy battle, which is TPP and TPA. And the president is busy counting votes. Does he have your vote?
Can't count on my vote.
You've made that clear?
No, I haven't made it clear. I guess I'm making it clear now.
I think you just did. All right, yes.
But let me put it in perspective.
What is the issue for you, please?
So I went down to the SCIF, which is a secure area. Typically, the Intelligence Committee meets there. But any member of Congress could go down there and actually view the treaty.
The draft so far, right?
Right.
Yes. Mm-hmm. How big is it, by the way?
So this is, I'm expecting to spend about an hour going over this new trade agreement.
Yeah.
6 volumes, this thick. I mean, unbelievable. And then you have a 60-page summary. You can't bring any staff in. And they're making it so difficult to even attempt to work with them on trying to resolve some of these issues, because how many times during the day do you have the time to go all the way down to the bowels of the Capitol to read a document in one of the secure rooms that they have?
You can't take pictures
anything.
of it, right?
No, you can't take anything.
Yeah, right.
So the process alone is very offensive to most members.
Yeah.
And
how are you expected to remember everything you read and all the points and all of that? No, you can't.
I set aside an hour. I mean, I've got to go back and spend 20 hours if I'm really going to review the material appropriately. I mean, we're getting summaries in meetings that we have. So the TPA, the authority, is one issue, which basically creates this up or down vote, no amendments, giving the authority
for the president
to pursue this trade agreement with only an up or down vote. I find that just an absolute usurpation of the congressional authority to evaluate these trade agreements. So that's one. The TPP itself is fraught with contradictions. Our experience with NAFTA suggests that at least 1 million jobs were lost. 600 manufacturing plants closed down in the United States. How is this good for the working stiffs in America? I would suggest it's not.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it will pass the House?
I don't think there's the votes there yet.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a tremendous pressure from the White House, and the president has made calls to House Democrats? Do you think that's going to move some of the few undecided? And there are a fair amount of undecided. There are dozens of undecided at this moment. But it seems like we've been tracking all the votes on our website, and I'm seeing a lot of no's, even recently, from House Democrats.
I don't think he can count on. I think there's 17 House Democrats that have come out in favor of it.
Yeah.
If he gets to 20, 25, I think he would be feeling pretty confident. I don't think you're going to see that. You're not going to see significant movement among Democrats.
Mm-hmm. And how many, Bob, what is your count of Republicans at this point? I mean, I saw that Leader Pelosi, one report, maybe it was in the Hill, said that Leader Pelosi told Boehner, you have to come up with 200 votes because there are 17 Democrats, and she was not whipping anymore, I don't believe.
Right.
I don't think she's whipping at all.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So that you got 17 Democrats basically are not going to get any more. You have to come up with 200 Republicans. He can't get there, can he?
No, I don't think so. I talked to a Republican member who their best case scenario is 200 Republicans. Best case. But they don't think they can get there overall. So I think you're looking at more like 180 to 190. And then if you add 20, you're still short, 20 Democrats. It doesn't have the votes now. There's no doubt about it. And there's pressure on both sides. There are some Republicans who are against trade and voted against Fast Track in 2002, and there are some Democrats, obviously a lot of Democrats who voted against 2002 bill, and most Democrats voted against the 3 trade bills in 2011.
So, Congresswoman, if this does not pass the House, then it doesn't mean there won't be any trade bill at all, right? It means that Congress will be involved in shaping a trade bill that you and others might be able to support.
I think that's accurate.
Is that right? I mean, it doesn't mean no deal at all.
That's right.
And that's just a headache for the White House.
But
nobody, but it doesn't mean the end of it. Right.
But,
and this process has been going on for a long time without our benefit. I was sitting in a meeting with tech execs from the Valley who knew more about the TPP than I did.
Of course, because they made the deal.
Because they're the ones drafting it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we've got to go back to, a democratic process to forge the kind of deal that will provide for our TPP and the kind of transparency that we expect.
I have to say, if I were a member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, and were asked to just give away all my authority to have any say at all in a trade deal with 12 countries or 11 other countries, and then just have a yes or down vote, I would say, no, that's not why I was elected, right? And
it was also one branch pushing back on another. I mean, the White House has been usurping, whether it doesn't matter who the president is, usurping power from the legislative branch for a long, long time.
Right. So I understand why any president would have a difficulty getting this vote.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Ira Shapiro, Ian Millhiser, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the show and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.